You are lying down, staring at the ceiling at 3 in the morning. Your body is exhausted, but your mind won't shut off, and that emotional or even physical pain keeps throbbing in the background. You try to meditate, try to think positively, repeat high-frequency affirmations, but nothing works. In fact, it feels like the weight is only increasing. This isn't random. There is an exact physical and biological reason for what you're experiencing. When you resist what you feel, your body doesn't quiet down. It creates internal friction, like two forces pulling in opposite directions inside you. Before anything else, just check your body for a second. Notice your jaw, your shoulders, your breath. Don't change it, just observe. Because until you understand what resistance is actually doing to your system, even at the most subtle level, no frequency, no method, no practice will fully reach you. And once you see this clearly, something begins to shift. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. You can lie in bed for 8 hours, even 10, and still wake up feeling like something inside you has been working all night. Not your muscles, not your mind in the obvious sense, but something deeper, like a constant internal effort you never agreed to, yet never stopped. It usually begins quietly, a feeling you don't want, a memory that shows up at the wrong time, a tightness in your chest that doesn't have a clear explanation, and almost automatically you try to push it away. You distract yourself, you scroll, you keep busy, you tell yourself to focus on something better. On the surface, it looks like control. Underneath, it's strain. Imagine holding a beach ball underwater. At first, it's manageable. You press it down, you use your arms, maybe even your body weight, but the ball doesn't disappear. It pushes back, constantly. The longer you hold it, the more force you need to keep it submerged. Your arms begin to shake, your breathing changes, and eventually, all your energy is going into something that, from the outside, no one can even see. That's what resisting pain does inside your body. There's a hidden cost to not feeling. Every time you suppress an emotion, your system has to allocate energy to maintain that suppression. It's not just psychological, it's physical. Your nervous system stays slightly activated, your muscles hold micro-tension, your breath becomes shallow without you noticing. Over hours, days, or weeks, this turns into a quiet drain on your vital energy. And the strange part is, you might not even connect the two, you just feel tired, unmotivated, foggy. You assume it's lack of sleep, diet, stress, or just life. But beneath all of that, there's often a continuous internal resistance running in the background, like an app on your phone that never closes, slowly draining the battery. If you pause for a moment and check your body right now, you might notice it, not as something dramatic, but as subtle signals. A slight tension in your jaw, your shoulders lifted just a bit, your stomach not fully relaxed. Even your breath, does it reach all the way down or does it stop halfway? These are not random. They are the physical traces of something being held back. What makes this even more intense is that resistance doesn't resolve the original feeling. It preserves it. The emotion doesn't dissolve. It stays suspended, like that beach ball underwater, waiting. So now you're not only carrying the original discomfort, but also the effort required to keep it out of awareness. That's why it feels so heavy. And over time, your system adapts to this as a baseline. You start to believe that this level of tension is normal, that this background fatigue is just part of being alive. But it's not. It's the result of continuous internal friction. In physics, friction is the force that resists motion between two surfaces. It generates heat, consumes energy, and slows everything down. Inside you, something very similar is happening. One part of you is trying to express, to move, to release. Another part is blocking it, holding it in place. That opposition creates an invisible friction that burns through your energy without producing anything useful. And here's the part most people overlook. This friction doesn't stay contained in one area. It spreads. It affects how you think, how you react, how quickly you get irritated, how easily you feel overwhelmed. Even small decisions start to feel heavier because Your system is already overloaded with this constant internal effort. You might notice it in moments where nothing big is happening, yet you still feel drained. That's often a sign that the exhaustion isn't coming from your external life, but from the energy you're spending trying not to feel something internally. Now, if you stay with this idea a little longer, something important begins to emerge. Because it's not just about fatigue, it's about what happens when two forces inside you are constantly opposing each other. When one wave tries to rise and another pushes it down, they don't cancel out into peace, they collide. And that collision has a structure, almost like a pattern, something that can be understood more precisely when you start looking at it, not just as emotion, but as interaction between waves moving through your system. If you look a little deeper into what's happening inside you, it starts to resemble something very precise, almost mathematical, not in a cold or distant way, but in a way that reveals a hidden order behind what feels like emotional chaos. Everything in your body operates through signals, electrical pulses in your brain, rhythmic patterns in your heart, subtle oscillations in your nervous system. These are not random. They move in waves, patterns of energy rising and falling, carrying information from one part of you to another. Now imagine that a feeling, let's say sadness, fear, or even a vague discomfort, emerges as one of these waves. It has a rhythm, a certain intensity, a direction. It's trying to move through you to complete its natural cycle. But at the exact same time, another wave is created, resistance. This second wave says, this shouldn't be here. It tightens your body, shortens your breath, sharpens your thoughts. It moves against the first one, not with it. And when two waves move through the same space in opposite directions, something very specific happens. They interfere. In physics, this is called wave interference. When two waves meet, they don't simply ignore each other, they combine. If they are aligned, they amplify each other. But when they are opposed, they create what's known as destructive interference. Peaks meet troughs. Movement is disrupted. Energy doesn't disappear, but it becomes unstable, fragmented. Inside your body, this doesn't feel like a neat scientific diagram. It feels like tension, like agitation, like something is off, but you can't quite explain why. Because now, instead of one clean signal moving through your system, you have two conflicting patterns colliding in the same space. Your nervous system has to process both at once, the original emotion trying to move and the resistance trying to stop it. This creates a kind of internal noise, a distortion. That distortion is what many people experience as anxiety or restlessness, not necessarily because the original emotion was overwhelming, but because the interference between the two waves creates a constant, unresolved signal. It's like static on a radio that never quite tunes into a clear station, and your body doesn't interpret this as neutral. It interprets it as a problem to solve. Your brain starts scanning for reasons. Your muscles stay slightly contracted, ready to respond. Your attention becomes fragmented, jumping from one thought to another, trying to find relief. But the source isn't outside. It's in the collision itself. If you pay attention, you might notice how this plays out in real time. A simple feeling arises, something small, maybe even barely noticeable. But the moment you resist it, your system becomes louder. Your thoughts speed up. Your body tightens. The experience becomes more intense, not less. That's not the original wave growing stronger. That's the interference pattern becoming more chaotic. And here's where it becomes even more subtle. Many people try to solve this by introducing a third wave. They bring in positivity, affirmations, forced gratitude. On the surface, it seems like the right move. Replace a low frequency with a higher one. But if that new wave is layered on top of resistance, it doesn't create harmony. It adds complexity. Now you don't just have pain and resistance. You have pain, resistance, and an imposed state that doesn't fully match what your system is actually experiencing. The interference becomes even more intricate, like overlapping signals that never quite sync. This is why sometimes trying to think positive in the middle of discomfort can feel exhausting or even frustrating. It's not that positive states are ineffective, it's that they cannot stabilize a system that is already in conflict. For a wave to integrate, the space it enters has to be coherent. It has to be open enough to receive it. Otherwise, the new frequency simply collides with what's already there and gets reflected back, never truly landing. Your body is incredibly sensitive to this. It can detect when something is authentic and when something is being imposed. And when there's a mismatch, it doesn't relax. It becomes more alert, because inconsistency often signals risk. So instead of moving toward clarity, you end up with more internal noise, more effort, more fatigue. If you stay with this idea, you begin to see that the problem has never been the presence of a low frequency. It's the conflict between what is naturally arising and what you believe should be there instead. And that realization starts to expose a very common mistake, one that feels almost invisible because it's widely encouraged. The attempt to place a good vibration on top of something that hasn't been allowed to exist in the first place. There's a moment that almost everyone reaches on this path where something feels off, even though they're doing everything right. You repeat the affirmations. You listen to high-frequency music. You try to focus on gratitude, on abundance, on peace. And yet, underneath all of that effort, there's a quiet resistance that doesn't move. It creates a strange kind of confusion, because on the surface, you're aligning with what is supposed to help you. But internally, something isn't responding the way you expected. In some cases, it even feels worse, like you're trying harder and getting further away from relief. The mistake here is subtle, and that's why it's so powerful. When you try to generate what people call good vibrations while actively rejecting what you feel, you're not actually shifting your state. You're layering a new signal on top of an unresolved one. And your system knows the difference. Think about a physical wound for a moment. If the surface is covered but the inside hasn't been cleaned, the body doesn't interpret that as healing. It detects inconsistency. The outer layer says everything is fine, but the inner tissue is still inflamed. That mismatch delays the natural repair process. The same principle applies here. When there's pain, tension, or emotional discomfort present, your body is already generating a very specific pattern. It's not random. It carries information about what needs attention. But when you immediately try to override that with forced positivity, you interrupt the signal before it completes. And more importantly, you send a message to your system. This experience is not allowed. That message doesn't calm your body, it does the opposite. It increases alertness, because now there's something being suppressed. Your nervous system shifts into a subtle defensive mode, even if your thoughts are saying, "I'm okay, I'm grateful, I'm at peace." This is where many people get stuck without realizing it. They believe they are raising their frequency, but what they're actually doing is creating a split inside themselves. One part is performing calmness, while another part is still holding tension. And that split requires maintenance. You have to keep repeating the affirmations. You have to keep redirecting your thoughts. You have to keep trying to feel something that isn't fully rooted in your current state. It becomes effortful, not natural. If you stop for a second and check in honestly, you might notice this, not as a failure, but as a signal. There's a difference between a state that emerges and a state that is being forced into place. When something is real, your body softens. Your breath deepens without instruction. There's a sense of coherence, like everything is moving in the same direction. But when something is imposed, there's usually a subtle tightness somewhere, a background tension that says, "Hold this together." That tension is the cost of skipping a step. High-frequency states like gratitude, peace, or joy are not tools to cover discomfort. They are natural outcomes of a system that is no longer in conflict. They arise when there is enough internal space for them to exist without resistance. If that space isn't there, the frequency doesn't land. It reflects. This is why you can listen to the most calming sound, repeat the most powerful words, and still feel unchanged. It's not because those things don't work. It's because there's no clear path for them to integrate. Your body isn't rejecting the frequency itself. It's responding to the contradiction between what is being introduced and what is being denied. And over time, this can lead to something even heavier, because the original emotion doesn't disappear. It stays beneath the surface, unprocessed, while layer after layer is added on top. Eventually, what was once fluid and temporary begins to lose its movement. It settles. What started as a passing feeling becomes something more fixed. Less like a wave, more like a weight. And the longer it remains in that state, the more it begins to express itself in other ways. Through the body, through patterns, through sensations that seem disconnected from the original cause. At that point, it's no longer just about what you feel emotionally. It starts to take form physically, as if the body is carrying what the mind has been trying to avoid. At first, it doesn't look like anything serious. Just a tight neck at the end of the day. A pressure behind your eyes that comes and goes. Your stomach feeling off for no clear reason. You stretch, you rest, you drink water, and sometimes it fades. But then it comes back. Not always in the same way, not always at the same intensity, but enough to become familiar. What most people don't realize is that the body is not randomly generating these sensations. It is responding to patterns that have been held for too long without resolution. When an emotion is allowed to move, it behaves like a wave. It rises, it peaks, and it falls. It has a natural life cycle. But when that movement is interrupted, when you resist it, suppress it, or cover it, it doesn't disappear. It loses its fluidity. Instead of moving, it stays. And when something that is meant to move stays in place, it begins to change form. Think about water. When it flows, it adapts to whatever space it's in. It remains flexible, responsive. But when it becomes stagnant, it starts to thicken, to lose clarity. If exposed to the right conditions, it can even solidify. What was once dynamic becomes dense. The same principle applies inside your body. An emotion that isn't processed begins to settle into your physical system. At first, it's subtle, a slight contraction in a muscle, a shift in posture, a pattern in your breathing that becomes a little more restricted. These are small adaptations your body makes to hold something in place. But the body is incredibly consistent. If the pattern continues, it reinforces itself. That tightness in your shoulders becomes your default position. Your jaw stays slightly clenched even when you're not aware of it. Your breath stops reaching the lower part of your lungs, creating a constant, low-level state of tension. Over time, this is no longer something you notice. It becomes what feels normal. And this is where the real shift happens. Because now the original emotion is no longer just an emotional experience. It has been translated into structure, into muscle memory, into nervous system patterns that repeat automatically, without needing the original trigger. This is what gives the impression that the problem is purely physical. The migraine feels like a neurological issue. The stomach discomfort feels digestive. The back pain feels mechanical. And while those systems are involved, they are often expressing something that began at a different level. The body is not separating these experiences the way the mind tries to. For the body, everything is integrated. What you feel emotionally, how you breathe, how your muscles contract, how your nervous system responds, they are all part of the same network. So when something is held for too long, the body adapts by containing it. But containment comes with a cost, because holding tension requires energy. Maintaining contraction requires constant signaling from your nervous system. It's like keeping a muscle slightly engaged all day, every day. Eventually, fatigue sets in. Inflammation can appear. Sensitivity increases. And the more this pattern repeats, the more solid it feels. What was once a passing state now feels permanent. Not because it truly is, but because it has been reinforced enough times to create a stable pattern. Your system has learned it. This is why simply trying to think differently often doesn't reach it. The pattern is no longer just in your thoughts. It's in your body, It's in the way your system has organized itself over time. If you pause again and scan your body, you might notice areas that feel dense, almost like they don't fully respond. Places where relaxation doesn't come easily. These are often the spots where something has been held the longest, and the instinct, once again, is to try to get rid of it, to stretch harder, to fix it, to override it. But that approach often repeats the same dynamic that created the pattern in the first place: force against resistance. Because from the body's perspective, that tension is not the enemy. It's a solution that has been maintained for too long. And if nothing changes, the system doesn't just stay in this state. It begins to escalate. The signals become louder. The patterns become more rigid. Until eventually, the body shifts into a mode where it's no longer just holding tension, but actively preparing for threat, even when there is none present. There is a point where your system stops adapting quietly and starts pushing back. Up until now, your body has been trying to manage everything in the background, holding tension here, adjusting your breath there, keeping certain emotions contained so you can keep functioning. It's efficient, in a way. It allows you to move through your day, meet expectations, stay productive. But this efficiency has limits. Your nervous system was never designed to stay in a constant state of subtle defense. At its core, your nervous system has one primary job: to detect safety or threat and organize your body accordingly. When something feels safe, your system opens, your breathing deepens, your digestion works smoothly, your muscles soften. Energy flows toward restoration and repair. When something feels like a threat, even if it's internal, everything shifts. Your body prepares. Heart rate increases slightly, muscles tighten, attention sharpens. This is what we often call fight or flight. It's not a problem by itself. It's a necessary response. The issue begins when this state never fully turns off. And that's exactly what happens when emotional tension is constantly resisted and stored. The body doesn't distinguish much between an external danger and an internal one that hasn't been resolved. If something inside you feels overwhelming, unpredictable, or suppressed, your system treats it as something to stay alert for. So even when you're sitting still, even when nothing is happening around you, your body can remain on standby. At first, this heightened state can feel like restlessness. You might notice it as difficulty relaxing, or a sense that you always need to be doing something. Your mind stays active, scanning, thinking, trying to stay ahead. Silence can even feel uncomfortable, like there's something waiting underneath it. As this continues, the baseline of your system shifts. What used to feel like activated now feels normal, and what used to feel like calm starts to feel unfamiliar, sometimes even unsafe. This is one of the most overlooked dynamics. When the body spends too long in a state of alert, it begins to associate that state with stability. So when things actually slow down, your system doesn't immediately trust it. It looks for something to fix, something to anticipate. Not because something is wrong, but because it has learned to expect tension. This is where exhaustion deepens, because being in this state consumes a massive amount of energy. Your body is constantly allocating resources toward readiness instead of recovery. Hormones related to stress remain slightly elevated. Muscles don't fully release. Your mind doesn't fully settle. Sleep might come, but it doesn't restore you the same way. You wake up already carrying a baseline level of tension, as if the system never fully powered down. Over time, the signals become louder. You may start to feel more sensitive to small things, noise, interruptions, minor frustrations. They hit harder than they used to. Your patience shortens. Your reactions become quicker, sometimes surprising even to you. It's not a lack of control, it's a system that is already stretched close to its limit. And when that limit is approached, the body has fewer options. It can't keep increasing alertness indefinitely. So it starts to alternate. Some moments of high activation, where everything feels intense and overwhelming. Other moments of shutdown, where you feel disconnected, numb, or drained. This back and forth is not random. It's your nervous system trying to regulate under pressure. But neither state feels stable, And this is often the point where people begin searching more urgently for relief. They try to calm the system, to relax, to find something that will bring them back to balance. They reach for techniques, for tools, for anything that promises to shift their state quickly. But here's the paradox. The more you try to force your system out of this state, the more it can interpret that effort as another form of pressure, another signal that something isn't okay. Because underneath the techniques, the original tension is still there, still unprocessed, still being held. So the system stays alert, not because it wants to, but because it hasn't received a clear signal that it's safe to do otherwise. And that signal doesn't come from control. It doesn't come from trying to override what you feel. It comes from something that at first can feel completely counterintuitive. Instead of moving away from what's inside you, it requires turning toward it. Not to analyze it, not to fix it, but to allow it to exist without opposition. It goes against almost everything you've been taught. When something hurts, the instinct is to move away from it, to fix it, distract from it, replace it, or at least reduce it as quickly as possible. That response makes sense on the surface. Pain feels like a problem, so naturally you try to solve it. But what if, in this case, that instinct is exactly what keeps the problem in place? Real healing doesn't begin when you successfully escape discomfort. It begins at the moment you stop running from it. This is the paradox. The shift you've been trying to reach by effort only becomes available when effort softens. When you stop trying to change what you feel, something subtle but powerful starts to happen. The internal opposition begins to dissolve, not because the pain is gone, but because the resistance to it is no longer active, and that changes everything. Up until now, your system has been dealing with two forces, the original sensation and the constant attempt to control it. That second force is what creates most of the tension, most of the noise, most of the exhaustion. When it drops even slightly, the entire environment inside your body changes. You might notice it in a very simple way. If you sit still for a moment and bring your attention to something uncomfortable, maybe a tightness in your chest or a heavy feeling in your stomach, your usual reaction might be to tense up around it, to analyze it, or to wish it away. But try something different. Let your attention rest there without trying to modify it. No fixing, no labeling, no story, just noticing. And then, almost quietly, allow the possibility that this sensation doesn't need to leave right now. At first, this can feel strange, even unsafe, because you're removing the provisional layer of control that has been there for so long. Your system might hesitate, as if waiting for you to intervene again. But if you stay, something begins to shift. The sensation, which once felt solid and overwhelming, starts to reveal texture. It may move slightly, expand, contract, or change intensity. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped holding it in place. This is the part that's often missed. Pain is not static by nature. It becomes static when it's resisted. When you allow it, it regains movement. And movement is what makes transformation possible. There's also a deeper signal being sent through your system in this moment. When you stop fighting what you feel, your body receives a message that is more powerful than any affirmation. This is safe enough to experience. That message doesn't come from words. It comes from your direct behavior. And your nervous system listens. It begins to reduce its defensive posture, even if just a little. Your breath may deepen without effort. Your muscles may release in places you weren't aware were tense. The background noise starts to lower. Not completely, not instantly, but noticeably. This is not about liking the pain or pretending it's comfortable. It's about removing the extra layer of resistance that was amplifying it. It's about letting the original signal move the way it was meant to. And in doing so, you create space. Space is what has been missing this entire time. Space for the sensation to complete its cycle. Space for your body to reorganize. Space for something new to enter without colliding with what's already there. Without that space, every attempt at healing becomes another layer of interference. With it, the process becomes almost automatic. You don't have to force the next step, it begins to emerge on its own. Because once the internal conflict quiets down, your system naturally starts to shift toward balance. Not because you made it happen, but because that's what it's designed to do when nothing is blocking it. And it's precisely in this opening, in this absence of resistance, that something else becomes possible. Something that was always available, but couldn't reach you before. A different kind of frequency, one that doesn't need to fight for space, begins to resonate naturally through a system that is no longer pushing back. There is a very precise moment when everything begins to shift, and it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. No sudden breakthrough, no intense release, no visible transformation. It's quieter than that. Almost unnoticeable if you're not paying attention. It happens right at the point where you stop holding on, not in a symbolic way, but in a very real physical sense. The moment you no longer try to control what you feel, no longer brace against it, no longer tighten around it. It can come in the form of a single breath where, instead of resisting, you let your body drop just a little. And then something unexpected happens. Relief doesn't arrive because the pain disappeared. It arrives because the fight did. That distinction is subtle, but it changes how you experience everything. Up until this point, your system has been working against itself. Even if the effort was small, even if it was mostly unconscious, there was always a layer of opposition. Muscles slightly contracted, breath slightly restricted, attention slightly tense. When that layer releases, even partially, your body immediately registers the difference. Your breath deepens on its own, without instruction. Your shoulders drop a fraction. Your heart rhythm adjusts, becoming less sharp, less urgent. It's as if your system recognizes that something it was preparing for is no longer happening, and that recognition creates space for relief. Sometimes it comes as a soft wave, like a quiet exhale spreading through your chest. Other times it feels almost surprising, like a sudden lightness that wasn't there a second ago. Not overwhelming, not euphoric, but clear enough that you can't ignore it. This is the shock of it, because you realize that the intensity you were feeling wasn't coming only from the original sensation. It was coming from the effort of holding it in place. And when that effort stops, what remains is often far more manageable than you expected. In some cases, the sensation itself even begins to change immediately. What felt sharp becomes dull. What felt solid starts to move. Not because you fixed it, but because you stopped freezing it. Your body knows what to do when it's not being interrupted. There's also something deeper happening at the level of your nervous system. The moment you allow a feeling to exist without resistance, you send a signal of safety. Not safety in the sense that everything is perfect, but safety in the sense that this experience is not a threat that needs to be avoided. That signal travels quickly. Your system begins to shift out of that constant defensive posture. The background alertness softens. The need to scan, to anticipate, to control starts to decrease. It's not a full reset, but it's a clear movement in that direction. And what makes this moment so powerful is how immediate it can be. Not because everything resolves instantly, but because the direction changes instantly. You move from opposition to allowance, from contraction to space, from noise to something closer to coherence. If you stay with it, even for a few breaths, you might notice that the relief continues to unfold in small layers. Each time you resist less, your system relaxes a bit more. Each time you allow, the internal friction decreases. It becomes less about doing something and more about not interfering. This can feel unfamiliar at first, especially if you've spent a long time trying to manage your inner state through effort. There may be a tendency to go back into control, to check if it's working, to try to deepen the relief. But that impulse is part of the old pattern. The shift happens when you trust the simplicity of what's already occurring, when you let the process continue without trying to shape it. And as this space stabilizes, even slightly, something else begins to emerge. Not as something you force in, but as something that naturally fills what is now available. Because when the internal struggle quiets down, when the system is no longer occupied with holding and resisting, there is finally room for a different kind of order to take place. One that doesn't need to push its way through, but instead settles in naturally, as if it was always waiting just outside your awareness. Once that internal pressure drops, even slightly, something opens that wasn't accessible before. It's not something you create, it's something you uncover. When resistance is active, your system is crowded. Every signal competes for space. The original sensation, the effort to suppress it, the mental noise trying to manage it, all of it overlaps. There's no room for anything new to settle in because everything is already occupied. But when you stop pushing, when that extra layer of tension releases, there is a kind of clearing. Not empty in a cold or hollow way, but open, available. And your body doesn't leave that space unused. There is a natural principle at play here, something that doesn't require belief to function. When a system becomes open and less chaotic, it starts to organize itself around more stable patterns. In simple terms, it begins to resonate with what is more coherent. You can notice this in very ordinary ways. Think about walking into a quiet room after being in a loud environment. At first, the silence feels almost noticeable, like your system is adjusting. Then, without effort, your breathing slows down. Your thoughts become less scattered. Your body begins to match the environment, not because you told it to, but because that's what it naturally does. The same process begins internally. When the noise of resistance fades even a little, your system becomes more sensitive to subtle inputs. A calm sound, a steady rhythm, even the natural cadence of your own breath starts to have a stronger effect. Not because those things changed, but because there is finally space for them to be received. This is where what people call higher frequencies actually begin to make sense in a practical way. It's not about forcing yourself into a better state. It's about allowing your system to come into contact with something more organized, once the internal interference is reduced. For example, if you sit in that slightly more open state and listen to a soft, steady sound, you may notice your body responding almost immediately. Your breath might begin to match the rhythm. Your muscles may release further without instruction. Your attention becomes less fragmented. This isn't imagination, it's resonance. Your system is constantly adjusting to what it's exposed to, internally and externally. But it can only do that clearly when there isn't a competing signal blocking the process. Before, any attempt to introduce calm or clarity had to push against resistance. Now it can move through without obstruction. And this changes how healing begins to happen. Instead of being something you try to achieve, it becomes something your system moves toward on its own. The body starts to reorganize around patterns that require less effort to maintain. Slower breathing, softer muscle tone, more stable attention. These are not things you force, they emerge as a result of coherence increasing. You might also notice that this process feels surprisingly gentle. There's no need for intensity, no need for dramatic shifts. Small inputs begin to have a bigger impact. A few minutes of quiet feels deeper. A simple breath feels more complete. That's a sign that your system is no longer fighting itself. And in that state, even subtle forms of support, like sound, stillness, or focused attention, can begin to synchronize with your internal rhythms, not overriding them, but aligning with them. This alignment is what allows change to stabilize. Because now, instead of multiple conflicting patterns, there is a gradual movement toward a single, more organized rhythm, one that your body recognizes as efficient, sustainable, and safe. But this process doesn't stop at the level of sensation. As your internal state becomes more coherent, it begins to influence deeper layers of your system. Your brain activity, your autonomic responses, even how your body regulates itself at a cellular level, starts to shift in subtle but measurable ways. What began as a simple act of allowing has now created the conditions for something much more structured to take place, something where your system doesn't just feel different, but begins to function differently from the inside out. When your system is no longer caught in that internal conflict, something very precise begins to happen beneath the surface. It's not dramatic, and you won't necessarily feel it as a single event. But your body starts to shift from a state of managing stress to a state of organizing itself. This is where a principle called entrainment comes into play. Entrainment is what happens when one rhythm begins to influence another until they synchronize. You've seen this before, even if you didn't notice it. Two pendulums on the same wall slowly start swinging in the same pattern. A group of people breathing together begins to match pace without trying. Your body is constantly doing this, adjusting to rhythms both inside and outside of you. Now that the resistance has softened and space has opened, your internal environment becomes more receptive. Instead of multiple conflicting signals, there is enough coherence for a stable rhythm to take hold. And once that happens, your body starts to follow it. Your breathing becomes more regular, often slower without effort. Your heart rate begins to stabilize, not in a rigid way, but with a smoother variability that signals balance. Your brain activity shifts as well, moving away from the fast, fragmented patterns associated with stress and into slower, more organized states. You don't have to track brainwaves to notice this. You feel it as a kind of mental quiet. Thoughts don't disappear, but they lose their urgency. There's more space between them. At the same time, your nervous system begins sending a different message throughout your body. It's safe to repair. This matters more than most people realize. Your body is always working to maintain and restore itself, but it prioritizes based on signals. When there is perceived threat, whether external or internal, resources are directed toward protection. Muscles stay ready, attention stays sharp, energy is conserved for quick responses. But when that sense of threat decreases, even slightly, the priority changes. Blood flow shifts, digestion improves, inflammation can begin to reduce, processes that were paused or slowed down start to come back online. Not all at once, and not in a way that feels like a sudden transformation, but in a steady, cumulative way. This is regeneration. It's not something you force into your body. It's something your body does when the conditions allow it, and those conditions are directly influenced by the level of coherence in your system. When your internal rhythms are aligned, your cells are not receiving mixed signals. They are not dealing with constant interruption. Instead, they are operating in a more stable environment, where communication is clearer and energy is used more efficiently. Even at a microscopic level, your body depends on timing and coordination. Cells respond to signals, release chemicals, repair tissue, and regulate functions based on patterns. When those patterns are chaotic, everything becomes less efficient. When they are organized, processes become smoother, more effective. You might begin to notice small changes that reflect this. Your body feels less heavy, even if nothing external has changed. Recovery from simple things like a poor night of sleep or a stressful moment becomes easier. There's a subtle sense that your system is working with you instead of against you. And this doesn't require intensity. In fact, the more you try to force this process, the more you risk reintroducing the very tension that disrupts it. Entrainment happens through exposure and allowance, not through pressure. A steady breath, a calm environment, a moment of still attention, these become enough to support the process because your system is already in a position to receive and align. Over time, this begins to change how you relate to your own body. Instead of seeing it as something that needs to be fixed or controlled, you start to recognize it as something that responds intelligently when given the right conditions. The focus shifts from doing more to interfering less. And as this relationship changes, so does the way energy moves through your system. The same energy that was once tied up in tension, in resistance, in constant internal management, starts to free up. Not all at once, but gradually, as less effort is required to maintain those old patterns. That energy doesn't disappear. It becomes available for movement, for clarity, for action, available for how you think, how you decide, how you engage with your life beyond just managing how you feel. What once felt like weight begins to feel like fuel. Not because the past suddenly changes, And not because the difficult moments lose their meaning, but because the way your system holds them is no longer the same. The same energy that was trapped in tension, in suppression, in constant internal resistance is now moving, and movement changes everything. Before, that energy was being used to keep something down, to maintain control, to prevent certain feelings from surfacing. It was a closed loop. No matter how much effort you put in, nothing new could emerge from it, because everything was being recycled into holding patterns. Now that loop is open. When you stop resisting and your system begins to settle into coherence, the energy that was locked into those patterns doesn't vanish. It becomes available. And your body, your mind, your attention, they all begin to use it differently. You may notice this in very simple ways at first. A decision that used to feel heavy becomes clearer. Not because you analyzed it more, but because there's less internal noise interfering with your perception. You're able to sense what matters without overthinking every possibility. Your reactions begin to shift as well. Situations that once triggered immediate tension now create a small gap, a moment where you can respond instead of react. That gap is subtle, but it's powerful. It's where choice begins to replace automatic patterns. This is where your reality starts to change, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived experience. Because your reality is not just what happens around you, it's how you interpret, respond to, and move within those experiences. When your internal state is fragmented, your actions tend to reflect that fragmentation. When your internal state becomes more coherent, your actions follow that same pattern. You begin to act with less friction. Even your focus changes. Instead of being pulled in multiple directions by unresolved tension, your attention becomes more stable. You can stay with something longer. You can engage more fully. And that depth of engagement starts to influence the results you get. This is not about forcing outcomes. It's about aligning the way you use your energy. When your energy is no longer tied up in resistance, it naturally flows toward creation, toward building, deciding, connecting, expressing. The same intensity that once felt overwhelming becomes something you can direct. And there's an important detail here. This process doesn't make life perfect. Challenges still exist. Uncertainty doesn't disappear. But your relationship to those experiences changes in a way that makes them workable instead of consuming. You don't collapse into them as easily. You don't fight them in the same way. You meet them with a system that is more stable, more responsive, more capable of adapting without losing itself. That's where the transformation becomes real, because now, instead of spending your energy managing your internal state, you're using that energy to shape your external life. Not through force, not through constant effort, but through clarity and consistency. What you pay attention to becomes more intentional. The choices you make begin to reflect what actually matters to you, not just what reduces discomfort in the moment. And over time, those small shifts accumulate. Your environment starts to reflect your internal coherence. The way you communicate changes. The way you set boundaries changes. The way you move through your day carries a different quality. Less rushed, less reactive, more grounded. And this is where the idea of transformation often gets misunderstood. It's not a sudden reinvention. It's a reorganization. A gradual alignment between how you feel, how you think, and how you act. When those elements are no longer in conflict, your life begins to take on a different structure. One that feels less like something you're constantly trying to fix, and more like something you're actively participating in. The energy that once felt like a burden becomes part of that participation, not as something you need to control, but as something you can work with. Something that moves through you instead of getting stuck inside you. And from here, the process doesn't stop. It deepens. Because once you've experienced what happens when resistance drops and coherence builds, you begin to recognize the pattern. You start to see where tension forms, where energy gets blocked, where old habits try to return. Not as a problem, but as part of an ongoing refinement. What you've seen here is simple but not easy. The pain was never the real problem. The resistance was. When you stop fighting what you feel, your body stops fighting itself. And in that space, something natural begins to happen. Your system reorganizes, your energy returns, and healing is no longer something you chase, but something that unfolds. This isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming available to your own experience without running from it. If you made it this far, write in the comments, "I allow what I feel." This shows you didn't just watch, you stayed. And if this connected with you, there's another video on your screen right now that goes deeper into this process. Watch it if you want to keep building this from the inside out.